Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the Trump-Miller administration's violations of the First, Second, Fourth, and 10th Amendments of the Constitution in Minnesota, and speak with Bruce Fein, a constitutional lawyer who formerly served as Associate Deputy Attorney General under the Reagan administration, General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, Research Director for the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran, and member of the American Bar Association Task Force on Presidential Signing Statements. He has authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the United States Constitution, and international law, and helped write the articles of impeachment for President Nixon and President Clinton. He's the vice chairman of the Committee for the Republic, and his books include Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle of Our Constitution and Democracy, American Empire Before the Fall, and most recently, Congressional Surrender and Presidential Overreach. Then, with Amazon's Bezos' $75 million gift or bribe to Trump to burnish the image of his wife via a documentary feature to be released this weekend in 2,000 theaters, we'll assess what kind of interest there will be in a movie that avoids any mention of Melania's early career posing naked as a model and her friendship with Epstein, which journalists have been wary of investigating due to threats of lawsuits from the country's so-called First Lady. Joining us is Nina Burleigh, a senior editor at the New Republic, best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show. A professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute, she's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, now out in a new edition, The Trump Women, Part of the Deal, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible. Nina is the producer of a recent documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow, and she has an article at American Freak Show. We will discuss Melania, the movie. Then finally, Sacha Linden Cohen takes a closer look at ISIS' history of deadly force following the recent shootings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good, which have reignited questions about impunity and accountability within the agency. She speaks with Lila Hassan, an award-winning independent journalist who focuses on extremism, human rights, and immigration. She spent 4 years investigating ISIS' history of deadly force, suing the government to obtain never-before-seen records, and creating the first and only analysis of ICE shootings between 2016 and 2021. Sasha will discuss Lila's 2024 story in Business Insider and Type Investigations, Armed and Untouchable, ISIS' History of Deadly Force. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. Joining us now is Bruce Fein, a constitutional lawyer who formerly served as Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Reagan administration, General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, Research Director for the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran, and a member of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Presidential Signing Statements. He has authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the United States Constitution, and international law, and helped write the articles of impeachment for President Nixon and President Clinton. And he's the vice chairman of the Committee for the Republic, and his books include Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle of Our Constitution and Democracy, American Empire Before the Fall, and congressional surrender and presidential overreach. Welcome to Background Briefing, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
So, Bruce, what do you make of what's going on in Minnesota, particularly with Friday's court hearing on the 10th Amendment grounds?
I think there's certainly a credible claim here. Mr. Trump has proclaimed, a national emergency, drastically inflating, the level of crime and even immigration issues. And Mr. Trump previously had claimed national emergencies in Los Angeles, Portland, Chicago. He then disclaimed the national emergencies, withdrew the National Guard troops. And so it's certainly relevant in the sense that Article 4 of the Constitution requires the federal government to guarantee every state a Republican form of government, and a Republican form of government is not a garrison state. But we're dealing in very interesting and novel times here. So there really isn't much of a track record to look on. But surely I believe that given the overreach and violation of state laws that ICE is engaged in, including violating laws against homicide, they have a very credible claim. You remember that the U.S. Supreme Court has made quite clear that the federal government cannot commandeer and compel a state to help enforce, federal laws, including federal immigration laws. And the federal government has stated, well, there's all this problem because the state officials are not cooperating with the ICE and maybe Customs Border Enforcement, but they have a constitutional right to decide not to cooperate, and it's up to the federal government to enforce the law consistent with the Constitution on their own. So this is going to be a pioneering case for sure.
So when Vice President Vance says that ICE has total immunity, where does that stand? Because what seems to be happening in Minnesota are violations of the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, not to mention what we just discussed with the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, first of all, it's unbefitting a Yale law graduate, I being a Harvard law graduate, to make such a, I think, unsound statement. The fact is that under current law, and much of it is cloudy because Congress has not enacted, I think, clarifying legislation, that if you are a federal agent or officer and you're performing and acting in a role as performing federal duties, you are shielded from the application of state laws, including state criminal law, as long as you're acting within a reasonable scope of your responsibilities. Now, what is a reasonable scope can be a very cloudy line from time to time. And so knowing let me give you the example, if I'm not encroaching on time, of the classic case where in 1890, there was a Secret Service agent was guarding a Supreme Court justice who was visiting California to sit on circuit. His name was Stephen J. Field. And so he was the bodyguard because the justice was a very controversial political figure, and someone at a train stop attempted to assassinate the justice. And the Secret Service agent then went ahead and killed the attacker in self-defense. So California tried to prosecute the Secret Service agent, Mr. Nagel, under state homicide laws, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that because you're trying to interfere with the federal discharge of a proper responsibility. But in that case, there wasn't any question that there was a true assassin and that the Secret Service agent was doing what he's supposed to do in protecting the justice from death. Here, it's not at all clear whether or not, although you can look at the videos and maybe that's not the beginning and the end, that suggests that the ICE agents that killed Miss Good and then later Mr. Petty were clearly acting well beyond any plausible claim of self-defense or enforcement of immigration laws. On the one hand, the deceased was exercising a right to keep and bear arms and was holding up a cell phone And in fact, I believe his gun was being deholstered at the time he was shot. And Renee Good was obviously driving away from ICE officials when she was shot. This is claim of self-defense is, I think, highly dubious. And whether those shootings were so outside the pale of any kind of reasonable exercise of federal authority, what would give the state attorney general the authority to prosecute for murder is a little bit, on the facts, a little bit unknown. But I'm saying that, in my judgment, and I've actually spoken to candidates for Congress and to members, you need to pass a statute, the Congress does, to say that when it comes to ICE, given the bad training they're receiving and the current leadership, Congress should remove any kind of what we call supremacy clause protection from state prosecution for committing crimes under state law in the course of their responsibilities. So that's where that stands. If Congress doesn't act, I think it could be a protracted legal fight.
Well, when you talk about poor training or inadequate training of ICE, apparently ICE reduced down the numbers of days that these new recruits were trained to 47 days in honor of the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump.
Not only that, but apparently one of their handbooks or references declares that you do not need a warrant to enter the home of a suspected wrongful alien. The Supreme Court is quite clear. The home is different. The home is not searching a bus. And that you absolutely need, unless you're coming in to protect life that's at immediate peril, you need a warrant. So they're actually teaching them bad law as part of the training, which is another reason why I think Congress needs to step into the breach here and make it clear that the ICE agents that go over the constitutional bounds are going to be sued in their individual capacity and damages recovered. And let me explain another element here, and I apologize if I sound too much like a lawyer. It's rather odd that at present, under federal law, if you're a state official, you're held to higher accountability for violating the Constitution than if you're a federal official. And that is, if ICE violates your Fourth Amendment rights, illegal searches and seizures, you can't sue ICE for damages. Congress hasn't created a cause of action, all it could at any time. And so the civil remedy for the victims of these violations has really been taken away by congressional inaction, and that needs to stop. I believe that's why you're finding these repeated abuses, because there's very little, if any, incentive for ICE to comply with the law. You got to make them accountable without any immunity and without the United States stepping into the breach and defending them. Then they'll pay attention if they think they could be prosecuted and that they'd be held accountable in damages for the injuries they've inflicted in violating the Fourth Amendment.
But Bruce, aren't we going back to before the American Revolution, where the redcoats had the ability, as they were armed and patrolling the streets of America, that they could shoot an American citizen, or not the American citizen of today, but the citizen back then that didn't have the rights of citizens?
Well, I think the general thrust of your question is quite brilliant, because the seeds of the American Revolution were what they called British writs of assistance, which enabled any petty clerk to come into your home, search for contraband, and indeed the military could actually quarter in your home. They could reside right in your home. And that was a huge grievance against King George III that provoked the American Revolution. And now we've come full circle. That's what we're doing today. We're having the militarization of domestic law enforcement. We have the federal government coming in and basically overtaking cities, making it so fearful that many of the members out in Minnesota, they're living in a crouch. They fear to go outside their homes. And that's simply wrong. And we need to deter that and put people in prison if necessary, if they're overstepping the bounds to that degree.
And I don't know whether you want to get into this territory, but there seems to be some inescapable comparisons or similarities, I should say, between Mad King George and our wannabe king, Donald Trump.
Yes, King George periodically was declared, insane. during the last years of his kingship. And I think it's said, but it may be apocryphal, Ian, that on July 4th, 1776, King George III wrote in his diary, "Nothing happened today." So, that may be a apocryphal tale, but at least with regard to Mr. Trump, I mean, he's so erratic, he's so deranged, where he stands up, says, "I can do anything I want as president. I'm going to take over Greenland. I need to own it. I can't just have it for military use." He says on one day, the only soldiers who died in Afghanistan for Americans, no British soldiers died, no Danes died. And then the next day, he praises their soldiers as heroes. I mean, this takes bipolar, to a new level. So the fact that he is so erratic, so inconsistent, and on the side, I know some people who work in the White House and says, "Bruce, you get assignment X on day one, and then it's the opposite on day two." He doesn't really understand what he's ordered, and he doesn't feel that he has any obligation, to act like a rational person. Everybody's frightened over there. So there is that resemblance between what I think President Trump, but he likes to be called king. That's why he wants to turn the White House into the equivalent of the Palace of Versailles with his $400 million ballroom. And he enjoys even going on the internet and having a crown on his head, even if it's supposed to be a spoof, because I think it's a Freudian slip that he does want to act like a king. And you remember he famously told the New York Times, "The only thing that can stop me is my moral conscience, which doesn't exist." And he's elated about making these boasts that he has infinite power to do whatever he wants. And that suggests a megalomania that we haven't really seen since maybe Napoleon marched on Moscow in 1812 and then came back from Elbe to meet his Waterloo. But this is totally unprecedented, certainly in the United States and maybe worldwide, and that the level of erratic psychological behavior that's characteristic of a child.
So you mentioned the ballroom, Bruce. He tore down the East Wing, but apparently on Tuesday he said that nothing can stop me building the ballroom. Is there anything that can stop him? Because it's bad enough having this president at the moment, but having his legacy live on as a perpetual insult to us all, with these monuments to the worst president in the history of the United States, is just too much to take.
No, there is Judge Richard Leon, who I worked with when I was on the Iran-Contra Committee. He's going to be deciding in February whether he's going to enjoin the construction because it's violated several provisions of law requiring consultation and environmental statements and things like that. Now, Mr. may well say, "I don't really care what a judge concludes and ordains. I'm going to build it no matter what." I mean, that's basically what he said when he said the only thing that limits his power is his moral conscience, which I think is an oxymoron. Donald Trump, a moral conscience. This is a guy who could care about anything except his own narcissism. So I think that's a little broad. Now, he may back down from disobeying a court order, because he has backed down like he did over Greenland. And apparently he's backed down over, he was going to invade Iran because they are killing a lot of the protesters, but he's done nothing on that score. As I say, it's very, very difficult to predict Mr. Trump because he doesn't have any qualms about doing the opposite of what he says. And he has shown himself willing to back down if he thinks he's running into headwinds. And I think that's why he removed, the head of ICE in Minneapolis, replacing Tom Homan, because he saw that the blowback was becoming very strong. So we don't really know whether he'd fulfill his boast. All we know that if it isn't fulfilled, it's just his political calculation that he can't get away with it for that time.
So you earlier in this discussion, Bruce, mentioned that you've talked to congresspeople and congressional candidates about the need for the Congress to step up and sort of fill these gaps that are being exploited by the Trump administration in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. Walk us through some of what needs to be done and how it can be done and who's going to do it, because the Speaker of the House seems like a total puppet in the hands of Donald Trump. He is,
But remember, he's been overridden. And under the House rules, if you get 218, it's called a discharge petition. You can override the Speaker. And unprecedented, that's already happened 4 times this Congress. So the Speaker is such a zero that, and on one occasion on the Epstein bill, it passed 427-1. But anyway, let me outline for our audience here. There are five steps that should be taken. One, Congress needs to enact a law that makes it very clear that for ICE officials and employees alone, it doesn't have to be across the board, that there is no federal supremacy immunity from state prosecutions for murder or any felony. Right? So then you avoid any ambiguity. Obviously, the state still has to give due process. They can't just say you're guilty without a trial, but there's not going to be any immunity from state prosecution if you commit a crime under state law. Secondly, there needs to be a damage action. Congress needs to authorize anyone who's a victim of a violation of the Constitution or laws by an ICE official or employee, a damage action. I would create treble damages plus attorney's fees. So they know they're going to be individually liable, and it's strict liability. There's no good faith defense. If you violated the law, you pay for it. If that means you steer clear of a violation, all the better. So that's number two. Number three, under current law, when an official, and this is for ICE, a federal official is sued, if the Attorney General certifies that the suit is over action that was within the defendant's official federal capacity, the United States comes in and has to defend and defends the lawsuit. That's called the Westfall Act. That needs to be changed. Take away that protection for any ICE official or employee sued under state common law of torts for damages. Then there needs to be what I say, an overcoming of a Supreme Court decision saying, this is 1984, that even if ICE gathers evidence unconstitutionally, you can still use the evidence in a deportation proceeding, which obviously is an incentive to continue to do with violation because you're still deporting people. And then the fifth, Congress needs to enact a law that says under no circumstances, even at the border, can you randomly search or seize or question or detain or stop people based without having reasonable suspicion that that person is present wrongfully without authority in the United States. None of this random sample, I've just picked somebody out of the sky, and we know it's typically because of their color, whether they look Asian, or they look black, or they look Latino. And Congress means to say that the minimum threshold before you can ask anybody about immigration status is reasonable suspicion. If you're not at that level, you just can't even ask anybody just at random. So if you have those 5 statutes in place, I believe, all these abuses would stop virtually overnight.
So, Bruce, just in the last minute, I'd like to ask you about, you were supposed to represent Nicolas Maduro, who was kidnapped by the U.S. military and is being put on trial in Manhattan. You were, approached by Maduro's brother-in-law to represent him, and somehow or other somebody else is also representing him? What happened there?
Well, I mean, first of all, number one, I didn't run around and try to ambulance chase anything. I got approached because there was suspicion in Venezuela that maybe there was a sellout because they believe the reason why Mr. President Maduro was captured the way he was because somebody in the inner circle had been bribed, and so they were almost paranoid. But anyway, the timeline was very, very fast. You remember on a Saturday, the president is abducted and he's put in a helicopter, then he's rushed to New York. And then there's an arraignment on Monday, and he's not fluent in English. And you figure, how could he appoint a lawyer, in 48 hours? He doesn't even know how the legal system works in the United States. And so when I was contacted, and I said part of this, I was reluctant at first. I said, really, you got to put something in writing. But people in writing back in Caracas, they worry, they put it in, they got a new administration, they could have their lives, on the line. I said, okay, well, I was reluctant to do it. So what I did when I noticed an appearance and there was an objection because I hadn't been able to speak to President Maduro directly, but just indirectly, I said, well, this was very, very a frenzied way in which he was he was taken and captured, and you have an arraignment within 48 hours. And why don't we have the presiding judge ex parte in camera just talk to Mr. Madero, with a Spanish translator, so we can know exactly what his issues are, because it's the client that gets to choose, right? No lawyer can force, and I don't want to force myself on any client. But the judge didn't. He said, no, I'm not going to do this in camera. I didn't understand why. I didn't cast aspersion on the other lawyer, Barry Pollock. And I think that still today, it looks rather odd that a president in that condition would be sensible enough to make a reasoned decision on lawyers so fast. Anyway, this still things are a little bit in motion, and I haven't done anything, and I wouldn't do anything unless I was confident and had an ability at some time to speak to President Madero directly and made clear, well, this is what it is. I don't want to represent you if you prefer other people. But the whole system seemed a little bit irregular to me, and that's why I wanted the judge to speak to President Madero in camera, but he didn't do it.
Well, Bruce Fein, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ian. You have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. And again, I've been speaking with Bruce Fein, who's a constitutional lawyer who formerly served as Associate Deputy Attorney General under the Reagan administration, General Counsel for the Federal Communications Commission, Research Director for the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran, and a member of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Presidential Signing Statements. He's authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the United States Constitution, and international law, and helped write the articles of impeachment for President Nixon and President Clinton. And he's the Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Republic, and his books include Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, American Empire Before the Fall, and Congressional Surrender and Presidential Overreach. We're going to take a brief station break, back looking into Amazon's Bezos' $75 million gift or bribe to Trump to burnish the image of his wife in a feature documentary that avoids any mention of Melania's early career posing naked as a model and her friendship with Epstein.
All right, send lawyers, guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Nina Burleigh, senior editor at The New Republic and best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show, a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, and she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and she's the producer of a recent documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow, and she has an article at American Freak Show, Melania the Movie. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nina Burleigh.
Thank you so much, Ian. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the movie opens this weekend in about 2,000 theaters across the country. This is Jeff Bezos's bribe or gift to Trump, however you want to put it. $40 million was spent at least on the movie, and another 35 on publicity. It doesn't seem to be working. From what press reports have indicated, that there's basically no tickets are being sold, and that Michael Wolff is reporting that Melania is really angry about being overshadowed by the ICE shootings in Minnesota, as though, how dare that interfere with my premiere, which is more than a whiff of the Marie Antoinette attitude. So do you think this movie's going to bomb?
Well, it sure looks like it is going to bomb, Ian. I cannot imagine what they were thinking when they agreed to release it in the theaters. It's hard to get any movie off the ground, even the really good ones, in theaters these days. And if this is obviously just a vanity project, and as you said, a graft, gift from Bezos to the Trumps. So it's not something that was, naturally of interest to people, I think. Or at least I don't think that they could have imagined that it was. Maybe they did. They live in a diluted way. But with books, with the vanity books and these right-wing books, you can pump them. You can pump them up. You can, have people buy blocks of them, and then they get on the New York Times bestseller list. So even if they're trashed by reviewers, they are still selling or appear to be selling. But I don't think they're going to be able to do that with this project. And so yeah, it'll crash. It'll sink to nothing. And like you said, I mean, it's this sideshow to the fascist activity that we're seeing in our country right now. It's an abomination, of course, and it's an abomination for many reasons, not just for her, we're worrying that extrajudicial killing of innocent civilians is going to take attention away from her. It's disgusting because from the very beginning, because she decided to hire for her as her director this Harvey Weinstein Jr. toadish, disgusting rape accused man named Brett Ratner, who was, 6 women have lodged Me Too accusations at him, including things like doing the usual, masturbating in public or in front of them, or forcing them to have oral sex. And in one case, actual rape. And these are Hollywood, not named Hollywood women. I think maybe one of them did come forward, put her name into it. But, so what did he do? He ran off to Israel and was making his life there. And then somehow Melania, with this money, plucks him back up and brings him to direct the film. And my sources, I talked to a few people in LA who are in the documentary world about this, and who know him or know of the project. And it was a big joke. I mean, for the amount of money, $40 million to make a quote documentary is so far beyond what documentaries cost to be made. Even the big expensive production documentaries barely get beyond 5 million. So they're not that expensive to make. So and Ratner was hard pressed to figure out what to do with the $40 million. And my sources said, in the beginning, people were, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going to film it like a feature film. I need 40 cameras. And they were just laughing about it, like the 40 cameras to do this basically gargantuan PR project for the Trump family. And now apparently he's living on the Mar-a-Lago property. That was reported. He is living in a big house on the Mar-a-Lago property, like a little pet. They don't like dogs, but I guess they have, this guy as their PR sentry. And he's there, and it's apparently his next project. So he's been rehabilitated to some degree. His next project is supposedly going to be on the Abraham Accords, the supposedly great success of Jared Kushner in making public really what was the ongoing back channel that had been going on for years between the Gulf royal despots and the right-wing Israelis.
So does this mean then that the RNC is going to be buying tickets to Melania? I mean, given that this guy, Brett Ratner, is such a sleaze, and apparently people that worked on the set on this movie were appalled by his gross eating habits and behavior, and leaving, wrappers and orange peels on the floor, just totally gross. We've seen him pictured shirtless, smiling with Jean-Luc
Brunel.
That's right. The guy that ended the sex trafficker who ended up dead in a French jail cell. So we've seen that from the Epstein files that were, some of them, the small amount that were released. So, and apparently, according to your article, Nina, this character, Brett Ratner, operated a model agency called Rush Model Management with Russell Simmons, and he later admitted that the agency was a ploy to pick up women. So this is a sleaze beyond belief. But then look at the Bulgarian in chief, the man in the White House. What a sleaze he is. So what do we know about her background? Because I'm sure that all of the sort of suspicions about what she was doing as a so-called model in New York, they've been very proactive in suing anybody, like the Daily Mail, and I believe the London Telegraph also.
And Wolf.
And Wolf, yeah, and Wolf's fighting back. So he claims that that Trump was set up with her by Epstein.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's to the model agency and this issue. I mean, Ratner. One of the reasons that I think Melania is comfortable with people like that is that she was, from the time she left Slovenia after coming in second in the model of the year contest or whatever they had in Ljubljana, she was enmeshed in this world of commodified beauties and men who treat women like mannequins. And I mean, literally, there are pictures of Ratner in the Philippine, I guess it was the Philippine Cosmo or something. We have pictures of him with one of his girlfriends, and he's literally got like a mannequin that looks like her, and he's kind of like making out with her and so on. And it's sort of this, this perfect kind of way that, or image of how these men, treated women and feel about women. So she's comfortable with that kind of man. And, if they were going to make a documentary about her, a real documentary about Melania, and as I wrote in my essay about this, this documentary is going to be totally boring, but you could make an interesting documentary about Melania if you wanted to try to pull back the curtain or open the door on this period of her life between Slovenia and washing up in Manhattan with Trump, where she says and he say that there's this, they have this like meet cute story where they met with Paolo Zampoli was involved, and at this Kit Kat club or something for the Angel of the Year. Of course, there's a Victoria's Secret angle to the whole thing, and that they met in '98. Well, in fact, I have a source who's on the record who will talk to anyone, Alex de Basville, who's a French, I guess, Albanian French photographer who shot the infamous, lesbian photos in 1995 for a British magazine, which are famous. Now everybody's seen them. The New York Post posted them in 2016. And at that time, she was bragging already about having this boyfriend named Donald Trump. And that's 3 years before they met. Now, when I published my book, Golden Handcuffs, which is also now named The Trump Women Part of the Deal, the updated version. When I published my book about this, they did not, I quoted Alex de Basville, and I talked about this lacuna in her history. I'm not quoting what the fashion people in New York say about her, because it's litigatable. They say things about her that are not provable, and so I don't go down that road. But in the book, I do talk about this mystery about the timing, and I then published a piece sort of off of the book in a British paper, and immediately her lawyer Charles Harder came down on the paper and said, everything in here is a lie, and we're gonna remove it immediately or we'll sue you. And the Telegraph editors backed down instantly, even though I said you can go and get Alex de Basville and he'll tell you, and everyone in the room will tell you that this is what she was bragging about. Nope, they were too afraid. They took the thing down, they apologized, and that was it. They wanted, this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted a little black mark on my book and my reputation. They could only do it in England, because in the US, that book was well fact-checked by lawyers, and in the US, truth is a defense, an absolute defense with these lawsuits. So, slap suits, they're, who's going to make that documentary to tell us what happens? How does she go from small town Slovenia to, what was she doing between small town Slovenia in the late 80s and then washing up in Trump Tower? And they don't want to talk about it. And you can imagine why. And that's the story.
So just in closing, though, Nina, again, we have Russian fingerprints, which is, of course, Nancy Pelosi once said to Trump in his first term, everything with you ends up in Moscow. It turns out that one of the co-producers on this film is the Argentine millionaire Fernando Sulichin, who has made films about Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and Putin, worked with Oliver Stone. According to Estonian Secret Service, this guy is tied into Russia and Putin. So what's his role?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we found out that is who is producing it. I don't know what his role is, but you're right. There is always the Russian connection. And, I mean, Melania comes from, the Eastern Bloc, and she was, again, like all of those women after the wall fell, self-commodified, came to the U.S., part of this flotilla of Eastern European beauties. And the Russian mafia is all up in that trafficking. Epstein was all mobbed up with the Russian, we know that he was in and out of that orbit as well with the oligarchs. So, she is in some ways very sad, in a way, a victim of this world that Trump inhabited and helped build, the mistreatment of women, the massive disrespect for women. And, she's just sort of used to it and inflicting it, the I don't care to you kind of response to the terrible things that are going on under her husband. Sort of par for the course. She has, what they call, philosophers will call like moral damage. I mean, something that, when you've been victimized yourself, you sometimes are, you have moral damage. And that's the situation with her. That's my, kind way of talking about her. I think that she's an introverted beauty with very little curiosity about anything in the world other than the sound of her pearls and diamonds clacking on the marble vanity.
Well, Nina Burleigh, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
You're very welcome.
And again, I've been speaking with Nina Burleigh, who's a senior editor at The New Republic and a best-selling author, documentary producer, and publisher of the Substack American Freak Show, a professor at New York University's Arthur J. Carter Journalism Institute. She's written 7 books, the latest of which include Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women, now out under a new title, The Trump Women, Part of the Deal. And she has a new novel, Zero Visibility Possible, and is the producer of the recent documentary series on Apple TV, Epstein's Shadow, and has an article at American Freak Show, Melania, the Movie. We can take a brief station break, and Sasha Linden-Cohen will be taking a closer look at ICE's history of deadly force following the recent shootings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good.
$1 million loan. Nobody makes it on their own without $1 million loan. And you reap what you've sown from $1 million loan. Call your father on the phone and get that $1 million loan. His enemies can't contain.
Welcome back. You're listening to Background Briefing. I'm Sasha Linden-Cohen. Today, we're going to take a closer look at ICE's history of deadly force. The recent shootings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good have ignited questions about impunity and accountability within the agency. And in 2024, investigative reporter Lila Hassan published a landmark investigation with Type Investigations and Business Insider and The Trace, examining how ICE shootings are handled behind closed doors, based on a 4-year investigation into 6 years of shootings. She's revealed a pattern of secrecy, failed oversight, and agents who rarely face consequences. So we are joined by Lila now to talk about all of this in light of the recent shootings. Thank you so much for joining us, Lila.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just wanted to ask quickly before we dive into the details, how did you get into this? What sparked your interest and how did you get started into, you had to file suits to get all this information. What was the impetus?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me to talk about this. The reason why I started looking into ICE shootings to begin with is actually the last time an ICE shooting had captured national headlines was in 2020. It was February 2020, and a Mexican man who was visiting his mother, he lives in Mexico, actually worked at the mayor's office, so was here entirely legally on a tourist visa just to visit his family, was shot in the face by an ICE agent in Brooklyn, no further than 10 minutes away from my parents' home. Went up to the house and sort of coaxed him outside, waited for him to get on his way to work, pulled him out, and this person on a tourist visa who knows nothing about ICE deportation, arrest warrants, and operations suddenly saw two men that he couldn't recognize pull his mother's partner away, got in the middle of the arrest, and one thing led to another. The ICE agent would later on claim to have felt that he was in danger and shot this man in the face. The bullet hit his arm, traveled up to his face, and got lodged behind his ear. And until today, he has suffered compromised vision. He has marks on his hands, and he has an ongoing lawsuit against the investigation and against the ICE agents. And so it was really my first foray into sort of understanding, well, what happens after somebody is shot by ICE? And I started to ask the questions of how many shootings had taken place. Is this common? Is this the first time? I didn't know that ICE agents could even carry guns. A little known fact is that overstaying a visa or having even a deportation arrest warrant is not some sort of large felony criminal offense. It's a civil offense. And so it seemed like such obvious, unwarranted use of force, but I wouldn't really know the nature of what shootings really look like in ICE for another 4 years. I had to sue ICE for the records of all of their shootings. Back then, it was the Trump administration. We were just 3 years, 4 years into it. And at the time, immigration was a huge talking point of the Trump administration. It would come to define his harsh tactics and desire to deter immigrants from coming here. And so I really wanted to look into, well, are there unseen violences that we don't know about? So that's why I got into it.
I'm curious about accountability when it comes to these shootings. I mean, you found there had never been sort of a roundup of the numbers, and you found that there were 59 shootings and 23 deaths since 2016 to 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, I mean, I'm curious about what you found in terms of patterns relating to how people were handling these cases. I mean, I know there's a lot of tension now surrounding who is responsible. Was there any kind of protocol about whether local police departments, the FBI, or any internal mechanisms within ICE were responsible for, looking into incidents specifically where someone was killed or someone was unarmed, all of these incidences that you found, what was the standard for dealing with it?
There are different standards to look at. So when an ICE agent fires a gun at somebody, whether or not they were injured or killed, and even when they are injured and killed, that happens somewhere in the United States, right? So it's usually the local municipal's police office or the state county attorney office that need to investigate what happened in their state. There's also a dual sovereignty doctrine. So that means that the federal government or the federal law enforcement agents can also investigate if they wanted to. They can partner and sometimes have partnered. But essentially, the goal of those investigations is to find out if there's been any protocol that had been violated or any criminal activity that warrants charges. What I found 20 FOIA requests later, so 20 Freedom of Information requests later to different states wherever I could identify the names and the incidents of the shootings, that there is no evidence whatsoever that any shooting led to an indictment. Now, ICE agents, as you mentioned, had killed people. They had also permanently injured people. In my investigation, I focused on the case of one man who was shot in his arm where the bullet reached the bone. And he was essentially disabled from being able to work in the farms and the chicken poultry farms that he had been working in prior. So he was essentially not only robbed of his health, but also robbed of his livelihood and his ability to support his family. So that's one way that you can look into ICE agents' accountability. And I put that in quotes because I'm not really sure what that looks like. We don't have a precedent to really look at. So if the federal agency and the municipal agency refuse to indict an ICE agent, even in the cases where they had violated protocol. So in some instances, I managed to identify where ICE agents actually hindered the investigations. They either didn't give statements, or there were body camera footage that showed a transcript of agents telling one another not to give statements. They refused to give a statement at all. There have been cases where in Arizona, and specifically, the investigating body had said this warrants further investigation, but no further investigation happened and still cleared the agents. There had been some cases similar to what's going on now in Minneapolis, where the FBI was the sole investigative body. And even in those cases, while they may or may not have found that the ICE agent had done something criminal or against protocol, there's no obligation to release the findings of those investigations. So we will never know, or may never know. They are subject to FOIAs, but they're not necessarily the public is not necessarily entitled to that information because of law enforcement exceptions. So as you can see, there's a big question mark. What does accountability look like? What does that actually mean? So if these mechanisms don't work, the other mechanisms that people can undergo to sort of get some sort of justice or reckoning with an ICE agent that may have shot them is suing them. Now, federal agents are protected by qualified immunity. And in the last 10 years, there have been two major Supreme Court lawsuits that essentially set precedent that people cannot people cannot sue federal agents for shootings, specifically shootings. So if neither the municipal agencies nor the federal agencies indict, and personal lawsuits for Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, or civil rights violations are not likely to succeed, I can't really answer that question about what accountability looks like because I have not seen it.
So there's like a sort of jurisdictional no man's land that feels almost intentional.
I don't know if it's intentional, but there's definitely confusion. So there's
Yeah.
one case I looked at in Virginia, for example, where the municipal body was investigating and then they stopped abruptly and almost out of nowhere decided that they don't have jurisdiction to investigate a federal agent, which is not true. All states have the ability to investigate any criminal activity that happens within their borders. But you can imagine creates this kind of loophole of not knowing where the investigation has to go. And what civil rights experts have told me is that as long as we're in the dark, we have nothing to really lobby for change or reform, and we have nothing to really analyze if things are going along best practices or even against the law.
I'm curious about the history a little bit. I mean, it seems like the agency has a pretty glaring lack of oversight when you compare it to similar large law enforcement groups. Like you mentioned the article, the LAPD, which has about 9,000 officers. They have several oversight boards whose sole purpose is to create some sort of accountability. I'm sure it's debatable whether or not that's effective, but at least they have sort of the infrastructure for it. And I'm hoping you can tell me why ICE doesn't have that, sort of a bit about the history of ICE and why it was formed and how that origin story might explain these missing mechanisms.
Yeah, it's a great question because as we discuss use of force today, we have a bit of a challenge, which is that ICE doesn't publicize its use of force policies and it doesn't publicize its documents. So ICE is one federal law enforcement agency under the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security was established in 2002 to unify both customs and immigration and naturalization services for the guise of, well, under the orders of enhancing national security and protecting national security.
Sort
So
of a
that's the
post
more
9/11. Yeah.
yeah, the post 9/11 context, exactly. And so ICE, believe it or not, used to have a little bit of confusion. It was seen by an inspector general report in 2005 or the early 2000s, I would say, to have a very duplicitous role to Customs and Border Patrol, and to have a little bit of a confusion on what exactly its law enforcement operations would be if there was already an arm committed to immigration.
I mean, this is slightly different, but I'm wondering when they started or from the beginning they've been plainclothes. I feel like right now in the popular imagination, you think of an ICE officer wearing a mask, wearing like a baseball cap, this sort of anonymity. And I wonder, I guess anecdotally, I don't remember that being so much a part of their public image in the 20 teens. And even the early 2020s, it feels like in this second Trump administration that has become sort of protocol. And I'm curious if you know anything or can speak to that.
So, what's so fascinating to me is when I managed to obtain some of the training documents, they didn't really have a lot of material to talk about how to present themselves. They had a lot more material on something called verbal judo, which is basically how to obtain consent from someone because their limits were not being able to go into houses and not being able to coax people out of their private, well, not being able to enter somebody's private property. So, to instead lean towards policies to coax people out of these policies. So, when I
Verbal
found
judo. Wow.
verbal judo. Yeah, it's a controversial tactic, but one that's actually quite common to law enforcement across the country. It's not unique to federal agents. It's also something that's trained and used by municipal forces as well.
Mhm.
But what that gave me insight into is when you compare that to the ICE logs that I managed to obtain from the lawsuits, where it shows sometimes that there is no police markings whatsoever on the ICE agents, neither on the vans or on the actual officers themselves. This can be a tactic because there's two bodies within ICE. So ICE is an agency of the Department of Homeland Security, and within ICE there's Homeland Security investigations and enforcement and removal operations. So ERO and HSI. HSI handles transnational crimes, undercover stings, human trafficking cases, narcotic trafficking cases, and sometimes pretend to be of the same criminal activity to gain access. And so in those cases, it's jeopardizing their law enforcement operations if they were to identify themselves. Now with ERO, they're the ones that are trained on verbal judo, and they're the ones that are trained to sort of trick people into coming out where they have jurisdiction over them. And so when we're looking at the images of ICE agents today, it's worth noting that there's no obligation really for them to adhere to a certain uniform. There is no uniform of ICE. How they choose to present themselves is wholly their choice and can be justified by the law enforcement operations, whether it is enforcement and removal operations or investigations.
Wow. I mean, we have to wrap up in a second, but I wanted to ask a last question about these recent incidents have sparked a lot of outrage. Unfortunately, that is probably related to the fact that the people that were shot were white US citizens. And I'm curious if your previous reporting found similar incidents. I guess I'm curious if in this new Trump administration, if this is novel or if there's been incidences like this that we just haven't learned about.
I think the current Trump administration is quite visible in its immigration enforcement activities. And there's a lot more attention now that Trump is back in office because he's made so many pledges to have a mass deportation campaign. And he's acting upon his promises from the campaign and before he even ran for presidency. So I think it's in the public view much more now than it was before. But there is a history of ICE agents shooting at US citizens. There's a history of them shooting at people, again, with legal statuses, like the Mexican man that brought me to this investigation to begin with. And they've shot an undocumented immigrant. Now, it's worth noting that even if somebody doesn't have papers, as long as they're on the soil of the US, they're entitled to US constitutional rights. And so it's not really a matter of legal statuses, but there's a history for everything that we've seen in Minnesota today. We've seen them shoot at people at moving vehicles. We've seen them shoot at people while they are off duty. We've seen them shoot at people while they're not identified. We've seen them shoot at people and endanger others in the process because they've shot in public arenas before. So unfortunately, what we're seeing today is not the testing ground. It's almost like an entire history leading up to this point because they've gotten away with almost every instance that we could imagine.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lila. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And again, we've been speaking with Lila Hassan. She is an independent investigative journalist, and her article from last year, or I guess 2 years ago now, at The Trace is called Armed and Untouchable, ICE's History of Deadly Force.
And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.